Baker Botts LLP provides podcasts for educational purposes only. They are not legal advice. This communication may constitute attorney advertising.
Welcome to the Environmental Evolutions Podcast, where we explore the changing landscape of environmental law and policy. I'm your host, Megan Burge, coming to you live again from my closet in Joshua Tree, California. This is a standalone episode on carbon capture, use, and sequestration. With me today to talk about CCUS, as it's affectionately abbreviated, are my partners, Aileen Hook from my very own environmental group, and Barbara DeMarinay from our incredibly creative tax group. Before we get started, I have a quick question for today. We're going to do a quiz. Here it goes. By how much did the global capacity for carbon capture, use, and storage increase between the end of 2019 and the end of 2020? I know you're all dying to know the answer, and you'll just have to wait until the end of the podcast. All right, so with that, I think we're ready to get started. And we're going to kick it off with Aileen. Aileen, what is CCUS?
In terms of what that means, CCUS is really, it's a process that allows carbon emissions from industrial sources, say, your local power plant or a refinery, for example, to be captured instead of going into the atmosphere, and then it's compressed generally into a very cold liquid state so that it can go into a means of transportation, say, typically a pipeline, but it could be a barge, it could be a truck, it could be a rail car or a ship, to a location where it is sequestered or permanently stored in underground geologic formations where there are, it's called pore space, little holes beneath the surface, and it's captured there and is prevented from being emitted to the atmosphere, which is a good thing for climate. That would allow the what otherwise would be an emission to go into a useful product instead of having to find naturally occurring carbon dioxide for that.
Aileen, thank you for all of that. I have to say, you mentioned a number of uses for CO2, but it has to be among my favorite products considering it's used in beer, soda, dry ice, sugary meat talking, algae generation for fish farms. I mean, the list goes on and on. What a versatile product. Who knew? But with all of that, why are we hearing so much about it recently?
Well, Megan, there are a lot of things going on in the world and in the United States that are really bringing CCUS to the forefront. It is a important part, frankly, of the UN's plan to address climate risk, and that's going on on the international level, and corporations are really focused now on something called ESG, which is environmental social governance. And one of the components of that really it looks at the environmental footprint and environmental policies of a company, which brings you to climate again. And there are fossil fuel companies in particular have been accepting the fact that there is a transition in energy happening and realizing that carbon capture, which has actually been around for a really long time, is probably low-hanging fruit in terms of initiatives that they could adopt and implement to start making a difference. And it also looking at it as a potential business opportunity, because they know how to drill wells and take things out of the ground, but they also have the same technology to put things in the ground. And then finally, on just the U.S. perspective, with the change in administration, the Biden administration's focus is heavily involved on climate. And he just put out an executive order that, among all of the other priorities in terms of climate, does specifically mention carbon capture. So a lot of attention on it. And I would say it's really a continuation. Even during the Trump administration, there was bipartisan support for some CCUS related legislation. So a lot of factors are all converging, and there's been a lot of research done in the past 15, 20 years that's all coming to fruition, and everything is aligning at the right time.
Well, that's really interesting, but I do have to ask, because of course everything is about my current home state of California. Isn't California playing a role here too?
Yes. California's governor, I think, is being helpful to the CCUS initiative as well, in terms of getting to, what's called decarbonization, to take carbon out of the atmosphere, and initiatives in terms of having low carbon fuels look for ways to offset emissions that do exist. And one of the ways to do that is to show that you're getting a credit for some positive carbon reduction activity somewhere else. And one of those is through carbon capture and storage. In fact, there are projects outside of California that go through the certification process for that credit and get to be used by entities to meet their low carbon fuel standard requirements. So there's California is definitely one of the drivers on CCUS right now.
Well, I have another question. And Aileen, you're welcome to take a swing at it, but I think we're all going to agree here on this podcast that it's probably in Barbara's wheelhouse, which is, how does tax play a role for CCUS?
And I'm happy to speak to that.
I thought you might be, Barbara.
And the reason...
I thought you might be.
Yeah, I'm happy for you to speak to it as well.
Well, so tax policy is often used to incentivize behavior. And so if, as a society, we have determined that carbon capture or CCUS is a good thing, then we would want to see how our tax system could support that activity. And when you're talking about tax policy and how it could incentivize behavior, I guess, would say that we can divide the actions that we could take into either the stick method or the carrot method. And the stick method would be to tax carbon emissions, or tax the use of fossil fuels, and put a heavier tax, a price on that activity. And that is something that I believe the current count is something like 30 different countries around the world outside of the United States have chosen to do. But in the United States, at least up to now, from a federal standpoint, we don't have a carbon tax. Instead, what we have is we have carrots, in the sense of we have an incentive, which is a tax credit for carbon capture and for CCUS, for carbon capture, use, and storage. And the credit has actually been around since 2008, but it was enhanced, made richer, more valuable, easier to get, more available, of broader application in 2018. And so, along with Aileen's comments about why we're hearing more and more about carbon capture lately, the changes that improved the tax credit also got people pretty excited, and there's been a lot of discussion about that. And so there's been a lot of interest in, and I've talked to a lot of people who say, we probably would have looked at engaging in these activities anyway, just because we need to do it as a good corporate citizen, or we need to do it because our investors are looking at our ESG position. We probably would have done it anyway, but if we can do it and we can get a tax credit at the same time, then we want to get the tax credit. So that's how tax is playing a role here.
Barbara, can you give us all the 25-cent version of what is the tax credit?
Sure. The tax credit is a dollar amount per metric ton of carbon dioxide that you capture from an industrial source, and that you then do one of three things with. You either sequester it, like bury it deep under the ground, like Aileen was talking about, or you use it in enhanced oil recovery, where you take it to a depleted oil well that's already been worked over but still has some little molecules of oil down in there that are clinging to the sides, and you push the CO2 down into the oil well and bring the additional oil to the surface. That's the second thing you can do with it to get the credit. And the third thing you can do with it to get the credit is to utilize it in one of these commercial applications, like we were talking about, where you use it to make other chemicals, to make cement, or potentially use it in food products, or dry ice, or meat packing, or things like that. So it's a dollar amount. It's unlimited, and you get it. It's an unlimited amount for 12 years from the time that you start doing it, from the time that you place your project in service, and it's rich enough. The dollar amount is something, it varies, but it could be between, let's say, $35 to $50 a ton. It's rich enough that for an average project, the total credits over the life of the project might be on the order of 40, 60, $80 million.
Wow.
Which is big
It's
money.
a big carrot. Well, that actually brings me to a question that I know has come up often in this field when folks talk about CCUS, which is, why should an oil and gas driller, fossil, get a tax credit intended to incentivize green activity?
Right. That's one of the things that when I first got interested in this area, it sort of mystified me. I was kind of like, isn't it sort of hypocritical to say we're going to incentivize green activity and we're going to give the credit to somebody that's drilling for oil? Yes, they happen to be using this CO2 that's been captured to drill for the oil, but they're producing fossil fuels. So how does that really support the green objectives? And the answer is, what I learned, which I didn't know previous to that, is that the oil and gas drillers have been flooding their depleted oil wells with CO2 for a long time, for years and years and years. It's just that the CO2 that they've been using is CO2 that exists in these natural deposits underground, largely sort of in the Midwest, the upper Midwest, where they pull it out of these natural deposits and pipe it to the oil fields and use it to get the oil out of the oil fields. So the theory behind the credit is, hey, we want you to use we want you to use carbon dioxide that has been captured from man-made sources, rather than introduce into our whole environment CO2 that has been perfectly happy sitting down there in that natural deposit underground all these millions of years. So that's the explanation. It's sort of like, if you're going to do it anyway, then let's use this. Let's encourage people to use the captured CO2.
Yeah, if I could chime in for a minute, a couple observations on that. One, it's, it gets me to use my favorite word, one of my favorite words, anthropogenic. So we're using anthropogenic or man-made, right, CO2 to avoid, the energy that would be used in, extracting the naturally occurring CO2, which is a good thing. And second, just, when we talk about EOR, enhanced oil recovery, and the CO2 being used, one of the things to keep in mind is, although it is being used, and some of it may be coming up when the production occurs, not much is. According to the National Petroleum Council, operational experience indicates that about 99% of the CO2 that's used for enhanced oil recovery at the end of the day is trapped in geologic formations and isn't going to be released to the atmosphere. So it is, although it's being used, it is being sequestered at the same time.
I'm still stuck on happy gas under the ground. I just have visions of emojis dancing through my head. So I'm definitely never going to think about CCUS the same after this podcast. Well, I know you two ladies work together a lot and have been working together even more so lately. What is the Venn diagram here between, as I mentioned, Aileen being in the environmental sphere and Barbara, you being in the tax sphere regarding the 45Q movement?
Okay, I think I would answer that by saying that the tax credit, right in the statute, right in the Internal Revenue Code, it says that the IRS, it commands the IRS to work with the EPA, the Department of Energy, and the Department of the Interior to come up with the regulations and rules for determining how much CO2 or carbon oxide is sequestered, placed in secure geological storage, or utilized. And so it's all about, remember, the credit is based on the tonnage that you do this to. And so it's all about counting tons, right? But the IRS doesn't have the people, and as a tax lawyer, I don't have the skills to be able to say this amount was, permanently stored, permanently sequestered, this amount escaped, etc. And so that's where there's going to be a lot of need for interaction and sort of cross discussion. And the area that going to be that's really kind of the Wild West, where everybody is still sort of feeling their way and trying to learn and understand, is that remember we said you can get the credit for utilizing the carbon oxide in sort of commercial applications. So let's say you're going to use it in cement, for example, or
Megan's beer,
or in the beer. Let's take the beer. Let's take the beer as an example. So it's going to go into the beer, and so the statute, the tax credit statute says that for purposes of measuring the tonnage that is going to be eligible for the credit, you have to have performed, and it's going to be performed by an environmental consultant, what's called a life cycle analysis of greenhouse gases. And so the idea with the life cycle analysis is that the environmental consultant looks at the product process from sort of soup to nuts, from the original generation of the gas all the way through to the consumer use, and says and then compares that process using that carbon oxide that was captured to what the total greenhouse gas emissions would have been if you had used carbon oxide from, say, a natural source, not the captured carbon oxide. And then it's the difference, it's the savings that is what is eligible for the credit. And so, as you might imagine, there are enormous questions around sort of the how you design the comparison and what the boundaries are for the steps that you're going to compare. You know, do you get to stop at the facility gate, or do you have to go all the way through to the consumer that burps after they have their beer, right?
Yeah.
And so there are all these questions, and they're unexplored, and these LCAs have to be prepared. They have to be submitted to the IRS and submitted to the Department of Energy, and you cannot claim the credit until you have had your LCA approved by the IRS and the DOE. So you can imagine how many conversations there are going to have to be between environmental consultants and lawyers and tax professionals to get this sort of system clarified.
Yeah, I have to say, when you're talking about life cycle analysis, Barbara, now you're in my wheelhouse. And where to draw those lines, is a perpetual, ongoing discussion, a living, breathing concept, we'll say. And I loved your example of, soup to nuts from the end use to the beginning. That was great. Aileen, is there anything you want to add there before we move on?
Sure. Let me just mention the other piece of this is you're getting let's go to the sequestration side. You're getting a credit because you're having a project that's going to, build the infrastructure and put in the wells to put the carbon back in the ground. And to do that, you need environmental permits. And so you can't even
Aileen,
spend the money
permits?
to do the project.
There's rules?
I know.
Don't be crazy.
Yeah, they're, Safe Drinking Water Act. We're trying, wanting to make sure that when you put the carbon in, that it's not going to affect underground drinking water supplies, because it's really not good for the water to be carbonated as it's coming out.
Yeah.
So we want to preserve that. And so, yes, lots of permitting, and we're at the cusp of a major round of permitting for CCS in particular facilities.
Well, Aileen, Barbara, it sounds like y'all are going to be working together a whole lot more in the future. We're coming to the close of our episode. Is there anything else you want to tell our listeners before we wrap up?
Yes, Megan, this is Aileen. I would like to just stress how important CCUS is in the climate change world right now. The International Energy Agency has showed that CCUS technologies contribute to 13% of global cumulative CO2 emissions reductions through the year 2060. It's 40 years from now, making it the third largest contributor to global decarbonization efforts after energy efficiency and renewables. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the United Nations organization, also looked at CCUS and concluded that the cost of achieving the desired global temperature hold would be more than double without CCUS as part of the mix. So it's really important. And one final thought is, and everyone may be interested in this, to the extent you want to put on your creative hat, Elon Musk recently announced a $100 million moonshot prize for the best carbon capture technology. So I'll be working on that in my spare time.
I suppose that's a different kind of carrot, not Barbara's carrots. different Karen.
That's right. And I have nothing further to add on that.
Well, thank you both so much. Barbara, Aileen, this has been very interesting. And I think it's safe to say that we all, the listeners and I, are now a bit more up to speed on CCUS. This brings us to the time to answer our quiz question. So, the global capacity for CCUS between 2019 and 2020 increased by, drumroll, approximately 1/3 per the Global CCS Institute. And there's a link to the Global CCS Institute in our episode notes. It's a great resource for anyone who's interested. Also, if you have questions about CCUS, please feel free to contact Barbara and Aileen. Their contact information also is included in the notes. We're at the end of our time here today, and I want to thank Barbara and Aileen for joining me.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you taking the time. And with that, I'm Megan Burge. Thank you all for spending time with me today.
Thank you for listening to this BakerBots podcast. For more information on BakerBots practices, please visit us at bakerbots.com. For over 180 years, through 13 offices in 9 countries, BakerBots has the experience, knowledge, and people to solve our clients' most significant legal issues. This presentation is provided by BakerBots LLP for educational and informational purposes only. It is not legal advice. Under the rules of certain jurisdictions, this communication may constitute attorney advertising.